Good afternoon and welcome to today's webcast entitled Financing Municipal Stormwater Programs. This webcast is sponsored by EPA's Office of Wastewater Management. My name is Nikos Singelis and I'm with EPA and I will moderate today's session. Thank you for joining us and we'll get started in a few minutes. While we wait for a few other people to join us, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. First of all, the materials in this webcast have been reviewed by EPA staff for technical accuracy. However, the views of the speakers and the speakers' organizations are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of EPA. Mention of any commercial enterprise product or publication does not mean that EPA endorses that item. We will have several question and answer sessions today during this webcast. To answer a question, simply type your question into the text box located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Then click on the Submit Question button. You do not need to wait until a question and answer period to submit your questions. Actually, we encourage you to send your questions in early. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. However, due to the high number of participants, all questions may not be answered. However, today's speaker's contact information is provided on the screen should you have questions following the webcast. You may also use the Ask a Question area to alert us to any technical difficulties that you may encounter. Please include a telephone number where you can be reached and we will help you troubleshoot your problem. For basic troubleshooting information, you may also click on the Help button located on your screen. There will be several occasions during this presentation when our presenters will ask you questions. The presenter will post a question in the slide window. Please submit your answers in that same window, not in the Ask a Question box. And we'll go through that again when we get to one of those. At the end of the webcast, you'll be asked to complete an evaluation survey. The survey will appear in a pop-up window, so please take a moment right now and turn off your pop-up blocker if it is on. Finally, this webcast will be archived indefinitely, so you can access it after today's live presentation. The archived webcast will be posted at this same website. I think we're ready to kick off today's session. Today's speakers are Andy Reese and Jeb Blackwell. Andy Reese is the Vice President with AMEC Earth and Environmental. Andy has over 30 years experience in a variety of water quality areas, including master planning, stormwater program implementation, and stormwater utility development. He was a senior author in the development of the Georgia Stormwater Manual and was the consulting lead on the Charlotte Stormwater Utility, which will be our case study today. We will also hear from Jeb Blackwell, Deputy City Engineer with the City of Charlotte, North Carolina. Previously to this position, Jeb was the Division Chief for the Stormwater Program from 1996 to 1999. And Jeb will present a case study of his county's stormwater utility program. Before we get started, I would like to mention again that we will have several question and answer periods, so as we move along, think of questions and submit them early. We have an excellent presentation today, so let's get started. I'll now turn the microphone over to Andy Reese.
Well, thanks a lot, Nikos. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. As you all out there can imagine, it's a little strange talking to a computer screen. So I'll do my best and just beam laughter my way, and I'll know you're around there. Looks like we've got a great audience. People are betting that I go over, so I'm going to make sure to leave Jeb a lot of time. He's got a lot of great information. Obviously, in 2 hours, we can't cover a lot of things, and what I've tried to do is focus on 10 main points. And since you can't see me pointing or gesturing, I'll try to tell you when I hit something that's important if you don't recognize it. There's also a bidding war for the gentleman in Hawaii to help him with his stormwater utility, and I think it's down to now that we'll do it just for travel money and beach money as well. So definitely let us know about that one. Okay, let's go right on. For those of you who have more questions than you have answers with this thing, I wanted also to alert you that there is a day-long course at StormCon, which is coming up on July the 24th. And there'll be more personal time there. Okay, well, let's just jump right in. Obviously, our goal is to find ways to fund our stormwater management program. I'll be following somewhat the publication that you see on your screen, Guidance for Municipal Stormwater Funding, and that was put together by NASMA, the National Association of Flood and Stormwater Management Agencies, and the names you see on the screen there were the principal authors of that document, as well as Damon Diesner out of Bellevue had a lot of input, and Larry McKinney out of Orange County. So I'd recommend you download that at some point and take a look through it. There's a lot of good information in there. Well, before we dive in, we've got a polling question right away, and I'll pass that back over to Nikos to lead you in that question.
Okay, thank you, Andy. As we always do in these things, we want to ask you some questions. So our first question today, we're going to ask you about the community that you work in or live in. So the first question here is, what is the population served by your community, your municipal separate storm sewer system? And we have a number of ranges there that you can choose from, and just click on the radio button that's right next to the question. Okay, so we'll give you just a couple minutes to answer that question, and then Matt, would you push the results out to the audience? Okay, and it looks like we've got the results there. Very good. So it looks like we have quite a number of people here from small communities with populations of less than 15,000, and then another good chunk in there from the 26 to 50,000 range. So that's good. So we, Andy, we have quite an interest from some very small communities here. And we have one more poll question. So Matt, if you could push that out for us, that would be great. And now we want to know how many full-time equivalent staff members you have working on your stormwater program. So again, just choose the radio button to the left of the answers if you have like 1 to 2 people, 3 to 5 people, 6 to 10, or for those lucky folks with more than 10 people working on the stormwater program. Let's answer that question. And again, just click on the radio button right there in the slide. And then Matt, when you think that's good, go ahead and push that out to the audience, please. And these questions are very useful to us. We've been asking some of these before. Oh, look, many people don't have, and that's an answer that we would expect in our live training courses. We ask the same questions, and typically 1 to 2 is very typical. We do see that there are a couple lucky ones there with 6 to 10, but the vast majority with just 1 to 2. So this kind of leads us into one of the things that we've been trying to do at EPA is to make the guidance relatively easy for folks and put all the information that you need in one place. And later on today I'll talk about a new guidance document that we're working on that will do that for post-construction. But anyway, we've covered that, so let's go on to the next slide, and I'll turn it back to Andy.
Okay, thanks. Well, that certainly is the evolving history of stormwater utilities. There are many, many more small communities now coming in, and certainly our goal is how do we shift from sort of unique, one-of-a-kind stormwater utility establishment to something that's a little bit more standardized but doesn't lose the ability to address unique situations in each community, and that's a challenge. There are certain fixed costs and fixed activities in setting these things up. Let me rewind just for a couple minutes and talk a little bit about what's driving our stormwater utilities. And the reason I'm doing that is if we don't know why we're setting one up, we have a real hard time looking with a straight face into a TV camera or into a reporter's eyes and telling them why we're doing it. And so really point number one I want to make is that it's very important for you to understand why it is that you want to set up a stormwater utility or why it is you want to go through a user fee method. On your screen you can see that 1800 on the left is sort of not 6 o'clock tonight, but pioneer days. You can see that there were things that were driving society, and as we go into the future, there's something now that's really pushing all of us. It's called gentrification. And gentrification really says that I don't mind spending $3.80 for a good cup of coffee. It's got to have 17 different things in it, and Folgers was fine for my parents, and but really I need Starbucks. I need something good. Or maybe for some of you that doesn't resonate, and this might resonate a little bit more, but normal donuts don't really do it. But if the good and hot light is flashing at Krispy Kreme, then that's the kind of donuts I want. Now, what does that really mean to me? Well, what that means to me is that the drivers for establishing stormwater utilities are changing pretty dramatically in the last 4 or 5 years. When I at least first started this business in the 80s, the drivers were all about flooding. In fact, if you look at sort of the list of historical paradigm shifts on the left side of that screen, you can see that really the drivers had everything to do with efficient drainage, and then maybe driver number 4 somewhere in the 70s, the paradigm was detention, keep stormwater from stormwater pipes, solve flooding problems. Driver number 5 there was master planning, came along in the 80s in a lot of communities. But as you start to look and phase into the late 80s and 90s, right around 1990, the driver shifts from, did I forget to tell you that it's pollution? That's the problem with stormwater. It's not flooding, it's not infrastructure decay. Our real problem is pollution, which hit a lot of people sideways. I remember traveling with EPA, supporting short course work, and seeing a lot of puzzled faces, a lot of interesting people asking, what about pure acid-driven rain, and why is stormwater now called effluent instead of runoff? Somewhere in the mid-90s, we realized that, with some deference to Clinton, we realized that ecology really became a significant driver. If you live, for example, in the Pacific Northwest or Union County, North Carolina, you understand that an endangered species really trumps sort of everything else in your stormwater program, at least in some people's eyes or in the eyes of regulatory mandates. Somewhere in the mid to late 90s, we all sort of took on a watershed look, a watershed feel to everything that we did. And we all were looking at statewide watershed programs, and everybody reorganized, and SCS became NRCS, and we all decided that watershed planning and watershed management and holistic watershed management was really something we need to be concerned about. We need to look in units of watersheds and so on. And there's an interesting driver now that's sweeping the country, and I think all of us by now are aware of it, whereas maybe 5 years we weren't aware of it. I'll call it the Green and Barrett driver, but what that really looks like is all these various names, all these various approaches. And they're an interesting bunch of things, an interesting conglomeration. I'm sure many of you have gotten involved in them, but you sort of can't not be for better site design. I mean, if you're a consultant and someone asks you, are you for better site design? It's kind of tough to say no. And so these approaches are really taking on. Probably the upper left, low impact development, is the one most of us are most familiar with, but smart site design or new urbanism, or on the structural side, LEED design, green building, green technology, sustainable development, all of those things are really coming to the forefront, and all of those things are reflections of a gentrification of U.S. society, which says that I want to live in a green neighborhood. I want walking trails. I want things to be softer, a curb and gutter, sort of all made out of ticky-tack, and they all look just the same. That was fine in the 60s and 70s, but really I want curving streets. I want green. I want natural. I'm willing to pay something for it, and that's a driver in much of the country. However, if you get in other parts of the country, that's not even on the horizon yet. So point number 2 is really to know and understand where you are in the process and where your community is. I was once in the unenviable position of trying to sell a community on doing a utility because of NPDES Phase 2, who had no concept of stormwater quality and were really struggling with sort of rust belt decay and trying to evolve a healthy economy. And it was really an uphill battle. There are more drivers coming, and as we look to the future, probably the most significant driver coming is the scarcity of water. That is, that water will become a commodity. I never thought I'd see this in the East, but the water wars in Georgia, water supply issues in North Carolina and Tennessee and so on, we're going to see a convergence of water, wastewater, stormwater, groundwater, water reuse, stormwater injection. There are even some stormwater systems now that have their own water towers and things. And so stormwater is going to become more and more and more precious, and stormwater utilities are going to become more and more ubiquitous. When you look then at your specific community and you ask yourself, why would I do a stormwater utility? This list here of about 9 items are sort of the big 9 that communities look at. And so you might run your eyes down that list and say, check, check, nope, that's not a problem. We're a stable community, development pressure. It wouldn't be a driver for me. And I think it's just really important at that point to say, okay, when I'm thinking about a utility, I'm establishing a mantra, or what we often call a compelling case for action. Now once the laugh track turns on. But the idea is that I may have some reasons as a staff person that are compelling for me to do a stormwater utility, but that's not really the question I need answered. The question I need answered is it compelling for key stakeholders or for the community at large? We've had, for example, we may have seen in the press in Iowa, a community there said they needed to set up a stormwater user fee because the federal government was making them do it. Well, while that may have felt true, it in fact was not true, and it's not the kind of a driver that makes people say, yeah, I'd like to do that, or we're out of money, I've seen that one used, or we'll get a general fund windfall. I've actually never seen a general fund windfall from a utility. But figuring out what drivers are effective is important. I know Jeb's going to talk about a stormwater survey that we did there. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. Point 1 is know why you're doing it. Point 2 is know where your community is in the process. Point 3 is build a compelling case. And that compelling case has everything to do with understanding what motivates people. I actually should be back on the slide previous, but what motivates people. Some people are left brain, some people are right brain individuals, and so we need horror stories, we need testimonies, we need video, we need pictures, and we need statistics, and we need understanding of why we're doing it so that we can convince various audiences of the reality. If we can't find compelling reasons to do it ourselves, we probably ought to think twice about taking the step until we can frame compelling reasons. What do stormwater programs cost? When you look at that list of paradigms and you look at stormwater program costing on a dollars per developed acre per year basis, you can see that as we begin to purposefully do stormwater, rather than do it sort of incidentally, incidental to roads program, incidental to planning, incidental to public works. When we start to purposely do it, we start to hire crews at $250,000 a year for crew. We start to master plan. We start to actually respond to complaints. We may move off the right-of-way with our extent of service. We start to integrate a stormwater quality program. We look at ecology. We start to think about greenways and walking trails and more advanced floodplain management and LID and multiple microcontrols scattered throughout, changing our design scenario. And as we do that, the stormwater program not only takes on individual definition, but it takes on individual cost. You cannot do stormwater, and we'll talk about what stormwater is in a second, for less than maybe $20 per developed acre per year. And as you begin to do it purposefully, even a moderate stormwater program that has a fairly comprehensive set of activities, it's $100 per acre per year, something in there. I know Bellevue, Washington, Damon Diesner's Stormwater Nirvana is up around $390 to $400 per acre per year. But for them, a compelling case was having salmon spawning in their downtown area. And so I think that's important. Okay, let's turn the corner just a little bit now. And we're about Yeah, I think we're on track, not bad. And talk about the fact that it's not just stormwater utilities. Now, while we're talking about stormwater utilities, the reality is that there's somewhere around 125 or so different methods for resourcing a stormwater management program. And some of those methods are better than others. I know when we're looking at the Las Vegas area, we had some ideas about slot machines and flooding. But a real point to be made and a point to understand is that there's a huge difference between resources, money, and revenue. And when we look at a stormwater program, keeping that difference in mind is very important. Resources are free things, non-monetary, donated, volunteers, goods and services. You might think of it as your neighbor's lawnmower. Money is one-time stuff. It's a grant. It's a loan. It's a bond issue. It's a impact fee. It's a plans review and inspection fee. It's a special development district. It's a benefit assessment. It's something where some activity causes that money to come in, but if that activity doesn't happen, that money doesn't come in. For example, you might have developers pay fees for plans review or for inspection, and those fees then help to partially or fully defray the cost of your inspectors. But if development stops, then what happens to that revenue stream? It stops too, which leads us to the third point, which is revenue. And revenue is kind of like you hire a landscape firm and therefore you have a monthly bill, you pay them and they come and they take care of your lawn for you. And it's like your paycheck. It's general fund money. It's a predictable, dependable cash flow stream. So when you think about a stormwater program and all of the various parts of it, and you can see on this slide if you've got really good eyes, I've divided stormwater up functionally into 8 functions. You can see that if you start to do a number of those things, that some of those things you can share costs with neighbors, some of those things you can do other ways. And some of those things, really nothing will work but revenue. You don't want to, for example, hire a maintenance crew and hope you get a grant to pay for them, because you're going to fire them next year if you don't get the grant. So when we look at funding a stormwater program or maybe resourcing a program, what we're really looking at is matching a set of building blocks for the program with a set of program activities. And there's a feedback loop. If I have money, I might do this activity, but not this other one. So as you look at your stormwater program and realizing that there's a number of small communities that are on this call, probably a number of you are facing up to the fact that you have a Phase 2 permit and you're going through some transition. And stormwater utilities are common enough that perhaps it wouldn't be unthinkable for you to do something like that. Well, in the same way, let's talk then about how we would design funding or design resourcing for a stormwater program. The first thing you should do is look at your local program and how to modify that local program. You probably already do. I know our firm participated in something like 300 Phase 2 permits, and I didn't really know a single one of those that didn't do already about 30% of what it took to comply with that Phase 2 permit, but it didn't look like Phase 2 permitting. We maybe already had a public affairs officer, but if we educated them, then they could be part of our public education. We already had, for example, building inspectors out in the field, and if we cross-train them just to simply recognize the fact when erosion control is not appropriate and to report it to the erosion enforcement team, then we've all of a sudden got a whole other set of eyes and ears out there at very, very low cost. And so there's a whole long list of the kinds of things that you can use just to modify your local program, and that's the cheapest, most cost-effective way to resource a stormwater program. Secondly, the next cheapest, most cost-effective way, if you get along with your neighbors, is to cost share. Georgia did a stormwater management manual. There are a number of communities where there's an umbrella organization that is doing things for you, whether it's publishing brochures or videos, or I know all of Dallas-Fort Worth did mapping together and saved an incredible amount of money. So sharing costs is a dynamic way to save money. It's a dynamic way to resource your program. I think the pitfall there is if they don't do what they say they're going to do, who's responsible? And certainly there are legal answers to that question, and one is a legally binding interlocal agreement is always necessary. Number three, even if getting free stuff from the web. Don't ever invent an ordinance, a brochure, a manual, educational materials, BMP, design criteria. All that stuff's out there. I feel a little guilty as a consultant saying that, but there's so much out there that's free. There's so many cities that will share things, give you things. I know, for example, the Metro Atlanta area has done some really funny videos about stormwater quality, and they'll send them to you for nothing. I know a few other communities around the country that have got that stuff up on their web. And I apologize to Steve Hogner, who I know is already listening in because you're going to get the calls. But there's just some wonderful things out there. There are some city websites that have great resources. I know the Stormwater Authority is a great resource, Center for Watershed Protection, and of course EPA's website is second to none with free stuff. Fourth thing you should do is look at partnering with nonprofits. It used to not be a great idea to partner with nonprofits because you were just never sure of the quality of the help that you would get, nor if they were really your partner or were just getting in close enough to really file a well-targeted lawsuit. But we've seen now again and again and again that nonprofits offer free or mostly free labor. The members tend to be smart, dedicated, they work hard. If they're in your tent, they may reduce your exposure legally to lawsuits. They take ownership of watersheds. And another thing is that there are something like 78,000 private foundations that offer 450,000 grants and give away $30 billion annually. And that's something like 8 times more than the federal government gives away. And so I know one community, for example, that set up nonprofits in their community, one for each watershed, and then helped them get grant money. And that fulfilled a good part of their stormwater program, especially the public education, public involvement part. Then there are federal programs. Every one of these federal programs you see listed on the right has some function that looks and smells like a stormwater program. Some you wouldn't necessarily think of. The latest Farm Bill, for example, has some master planning money in it. Federal highways with the T21 money, and so on. Every one of those. HUD redevelopment, some of that money is used for redevelopment of stormwater systems within older neighborhoods. And so we've set up stormwater utilities using federal dollars as BMP money or as in other ways. I remember one utility we set up, they generated about $1.2 million in revenue every year, a community of about 20,000. But every year for the first 4 years that I was tracking them, they generated over $2 million in cost share money from the federal government by being able to pledge the revenue from their utility to leverage federal dollars. The next way that you can generate resources is through corporate sponsorship. It still is good business to be a good environmental citizen. And you can get corporate sponsors for events. They'll fund internships, summer interns. They'll adopt watersheds and do cleanup. You can do partnerships. Here's an interesting example out of California. Adopt a storm drain where a corporation will actually pay money to have their logo put on a sign, which is a public education outreach. Now, I don't know if I put Chevron on a catch basin insert. That seems a little bit like Sikkim, but anyway, great ideas. Now, I'm sure there are limits to the use of corporate sponsorship. You probably don't want to go quite this far, although if you're thinking college education, this may not be a bad move. Okay, let's move on to the next one. All sorts of state and regional grants. Notice that we're really talking so far resources and money. But there's all kinds of grants, federal grants and state grants that are administered in various ways by various people. I don't want to go much more into that one. They're great websites. Then there are fees for services, or sort of innovative ways. And I've put together a kind of a quickie list for you to look at. But For example, some communities fully recover the cost of their plans reviewers and their inspectors through plans review fees. Some people charge a stormwater tap fee. Anything that you can do with a water or wastewater utility, if you set up a stormwater utility, you have all of those secondary funding methods as well. Impact fees for stormwater, latecomer fees where one developer puts in an oversized stormwater system in anticipation of someone building later, and the community is just the bookkeeper. Environmental impact fees, some people make the tie-in, especially in California or other places where a stormwater utility, New York for example, where stormwater utilities are either difficult or not legal. They'll make the tie-in between water, sewer, or solid waste and actually do an environmental surcharge on each of those utility bills, which is dedicated to stormwater. It doesn't generate enough revenue to do a lot of things, but if you have no revenue, some revenue is great. There is also environmental checkoffs. Some have looked at redevelopment and tax increment financing. Out in California, down in the Orange County area, we're looking at this, where you use tax increment financing and actually create a water quality urban blight district. And a part of the tax increment funding actually goes to stormwater restoration. So there are a lot of sort of innovative ways, but let's get on now to the more mundane. There's all the usual culprits. Everything that pools into the general fund, we'll talk a little bit more about these categories, so I don't want to hit them now, but there's all sort of the standard ways that you do it. And then there's a stormwater utility user fee. And notice on that list that I've saved that for last. If you can simply increase your general fund property taxes, you ought to do that. It's simple, it's easy. But you know what, there wouldn't be 500 people on this call if that was simple and easy. And so we're going to focus now the rest of our time on that stormwater utility user fee part of it. We'll maybe touch on some secondary funding methods. But I guess I wanted to say that point number 4 is that it's very important that you think in terms of a building block program with a building block resourcing mechanism. And that's sort of in the left-hand column, you have all your program activities. On the right-hand column, you have all the various ways you intend to resource those. We have actually gone so far as to write things into a permit that says that if we can get this kind of funding method, then we will do this kind of program. But if we can't, then we'll do this kind of program instead. Because really, funding is a constraint, and as we all know. Okay, a couple of summary comments then. You can't live off of grants and loans. I'm involved with some nonprofits, and really a lot of their effort is spent just generating money so that they can survive. And you don't want a stormwater program to have to live that way. There's a large human cost effort in free resources. We always say there's no such thing as a free lunch, no such thing as a free resource. I remember up in the Northwest, I talked to the community about using Boy Scouts for doing storm drain stenciling. They said, that's fine, but we need 2 road guards for every 2-person Boy Scout crew, and at that point, it'd be easier for just to do it ourselves. And so there is a human cost there. The next thing is that long-term operations, things that require revenue, things that you need to do a 5-year plan, you need to hire staff and you can't just fire them, make up well over half of our program cost, and therefore a mix of methods makes a lot of sense. But remember the feedback loop, that you can sometimes construct your program based not totally on your needs, but based on your funding sources as well. Well, with that, let's take a real short break and go to Nikos for another polling question.
Okay, thank you, Andy. And we do have 2 polling questions, and then we're going to start answering some of the questions from the audience. So if you haven't submitted any questions for Andy and you want to do so, right now is the time to get them typed in. But first, 2 poll questions. First, we just want to get a better count of how many people are out there listening today. We know that there are probably groups. So if you can just click on one of the radio buttons, if it's just you by yourself at your computer, that's fine. But if you have some friends or colleagues sitting with you, go ahead and click on the most appropriate answer there, just so we have a better sense of that. And we will take a look and see what those results are. Okay, it looks like a number of people have answered that question, so I will show that to you. Okay, and so most are just by themselves, but we do have a significant number in small groups there, so 24% are sitting in groups. And a second question here for you. If you were going to set up a stormwater utility, what would be the number one reason that you would do that? And just choose the one answer there that most describes your situation, whether you have flooding problems, whether you have aging infrastructure, whether you have a lot of development and growth going on in your area, et cetera, et cetera. So again, click on the radio buttons, and we'll take a look and see what the answers are there. And then, as I said, in a few minutes, in a few seconds actually, we'll open it up for some questions from the audience. All right, let's take a look and see what the answers are here. Well, I'm surprised by that. The most popular answer is because EPA made me do it. But we do have significant numbers say that water quality and ecology and flooding problems. So we still have a lot of those sort of traditional flooding concerns out there too as well, which is interesting. Also aging infrastructures, no one really answered that, or development pressures. Perhaps we'll let you, we may come back to that one later. All right, let's look at some questions from the audience. We do have a few good questions here. So Andy, the first one here is from Lisa in Florida. And she would like to know, have you seen any examples of stormwater utility rates encouraging low-impact development or reduced impervious surfaces? For example, a commercial property that might want to decrease the parking or use alternative parking in order to reduce their monthly stormwater utility rates.
That's a great question. And yeah, well, number one, reduced imperviousness is often its own reward because the stormwater fee is based on imperviousness. So if you reduce it, you're rewarded that way. But secondly, the newer utilities that are being set up, you know, there's, I don't know, 300-400 stormwater utilities already. The newer ones, and certainly the newer rate structures that we're doing, do reflect that. For example, the whole state of Georgia has established a green credit mechanism right in their stormwater design criteria. And as we set up utilities in Georgia and others do, we're looking at reflecting that green credit in the financial credit as well. You do run afoul of some zoning codes where they have a mandated number of parking places, and you can either A, change zoning, or B, allow for alternate parking, or for treating the parking runoff significantly through bioretention or things like that, or using impervious surfaces, and then count that as non-impervious and give a credit that way. But I would certainly encourage the utilities that are being set up now to look hard at giving that credit. The other part of that answer is don't give a credit that's so complicated that you can't administer it. I've seen very, very complex crediting mechanisms that nobody on earth can keep track of that database. But great question.
Yeah, I thought it was a good question too. Okay, we have another one here from Jana, and she would like to know, what is the average stormwater utility fee across the nation?
The average is $3.82. I'm going to show you a slide about that a little bit ahead, so let's hold that one. But I'll show you an average and a median of at least about 430 utilities that I've got data on.
All right, very good. And then I think we have time for one more. A while back, Andy, you had a slide that showed a bar or a graph with typical stormwater costs for ranging from a run it in the ditches up to a quote-unquote green and bear it scenario. And Jennifer would like to know, how do you convince a community that's still in this flooding paradigm to move up that scale towards the green and bear it mentality?
Well, go take an abnormal psychology class in some summer university course. You know, it's not an easy thing, and we're going. in the day-long course, I'm not advertising for it, but in the day-long course we spend a good bit more time on building that compelling case. But really it's one of those things where you start with a few stakeholders and you walk them through the issues. You build a very strong case. Look at examples of other communities. Sometimes we're not just trying to solve issues, but what we're trying to do is to attain something that we want. For example, we set up a utility in Tennessee, in eastern Tennessee, and one of their real drivers was the love of their creek that flowed through the middle of the city, and their desire to reestablish, maintain, and extend a greenway system that really was an economic driver in the community. And part of that greenway system was the fact that clean water is a lot more attractive than smelly water. For example, some communities have a real problem in that there's no access to any of the streams, and if people don't have access, they don't have ownership, and if they don't have ownership, they don't want to pay anything for it. And so that's sort of a roundabout answer, but the reality is that you look at your community and you come up with a roadmap or an action plan for building support that has milestone checks along the way, and when you think you've reached a tipping point, then you begin to emerge more publicly with that idea. But what you're not selling is being out of money or needing more money. That's the last thing people hear. The first thing they hear is either A, we have significant issues that we need to resolve, the public needs to resolve them, private actions can't do it, and secondly, we have significant opportunities to build or restore the kind of community we all like. And water resources and flowing water is a significant economic driver. The largest economic driver in South Texas is a flood control channel that somebody thought was more than a flood control channel, called the San Antonio Riverwalk. Okay, let's go on.
Okay, I think just in the interest of time, we'll move on. And so I will send you to your next slide, Andy, and you can keep going.
Okay, let's move right on then. And in this section, we're going to talk about some of the arguments that you can make to yourself and to others as to what makes a stormwater utility better. And my fifth point I want to make is when you say stormwater utility, understand what you mean by stormwater utility. And by that I mean, at its most basic, a stormwater utility is just a funding method. That's all it is. It's just a way to get money. But if you're going to charge somebody a fee for doing something they thought they were getting for nothing, you'd better do more than what you used to do. And so secondly, a stormwater utility is a program concept. The utility fixes streams. The utility educates the public. The utility goes into schools. The utility complies, blah, blah, does these things. And lastly, but not necessarily, the stormwater utility is an organizational entity. We were in one community where some of the political leadership seemed opposed to the idea, and actually we went out for drinks, and about 2 hours into it, when everybody was talking fairly freely, we kind of talked about, well, why does this seem negative to you? And the answer was we don't want another bureaucracy. And I realized, this is probably 15 years ago, I realized that they were thinking utility and they were thinking bureaucracy, organizational entity, new trucks, and I was thinking just a way to get money. So number one, a utility is just a funding mechanism. It's a special revenue fund or an enterprise fund within local government. Secondly, it's a program concept, and what I'm selling is service. And thirdly, it is an organizational entity that supports that program concept and uses that set of funding methods. But I've seen a wide variety, as have others, a wide variety of organizations be very successful. When Tulsa first set up their utility in the 70s, they had a couple hundred people. They had their own PR people, their own lawyers, their own mechanics, everything. When Cincinnati set theirs up, they had about 15 people, and they contracted out all other services, and those 15 were primarily contract managers. Both utilities are very successful, and so you can do it organizationally any number of ways, but what you can't do any number of ways is an effective program. You really need to focus on that program. Utilities have grown really fast I know our firm is probably setting up 20 of them, maybe 25 right now in various parts of the country, and they're just popping up everywhere. I would guess in the next 10 years, it'll be a little bit like wastewater utilities. It'll be more and more rare that a community doesn't fund stormwater as a utility. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But let's talk a bit about the advantages of a user fee method for stormwater funding. And I like to use this little acronym, SAFE, just because it makes me feel good, but stable, adequate, flexible, and equitable. First of all, and those of you, especially in a small town, know that stormwater can never compete with police and schools and fire. It simply can't. And so your program goes up and down, up and down, up and down. If there's a big flood, you get some money. If there's a grant, you get some money. But really, you're operating in that trough. And that's the maximum possible stable program you can operate. The good thing about a stormwater user fee is that you have a stable source, not of resources, not of money, but you have a stable source of revenue. You can plan a 20-year capital program. You can issue bonds. You can leverage Corps of Engineers dollars. And the good thing about it is that every time a new Walmart goes in, your revenue goes up. You're not stuck with a fixed general fund budget, but your fee grows as the community grows without you having to adjust the fee one bit. Here's the answer to that question about utilities and what the fees are. I guess, yeah, my latest is $375. The reason it used to be up in the upper 80s, but so many smaller communities have gone in, and many of them have gone in with fees that are less than what they really need to try to get something established, or they're trying to pay just for part of the stormwater program. And so you've certainly got apples and oranges and then lemons and whatever in there. I can't imagine having a stormwater utility that tries to fund a comprehensive program for less than $3 something. You just can't do it. I don't actually think you can do it for less than $5 or $6 per equivalent residential unit per month. I'll talk about what those mean. Let's go back to that slide about cost again, because I want to make a point. When we look at and just use sort of generic descriptors of a stormwater program, if you think about your community and how big your community is in terms of developed acreage, and by that I mean just draw an amoeba around the outer perimeter of your community and figure out about how many square miles or acres it is. If you want to have sort of a moderate program, multiply the acres by 125, and that's about what a moderate program will cost you. If you want to have a pretty advanced stormwater program, you're in the $175 and up range. One of the good things about a stormwater user fee is that you can charge a fee that is less than many people's willingness to pay, although I know some people wouldn't want to pay anything, but it's less than many people's willingness to pay, but it's still high enough to run a fairly comprehensive program, lock, stock, and barrel. So for example, a $4 to $5 per month fee will give you a moderate program, and so on. And so you can see then that one of the good things about a utility is that it generates the A part of SAFE. It generates adequate revenue to do a good job running a stormwater program. We wouldn't be having this seminar if a $10 a month fee would give you half of what you needed. Utilities just wouldn't thrive. But the reality is that in many communities, they're willing to pay $3 or $4 if you do a good job at building the compelling case, and $3 or $4 will get you a pretty good chunk of revenue. So with that, let's go on to the next polling question. Nikos? Hello, Nikos.
All right, Aaron. Hello. Yes. Our first question is, how would you characterize your program based on what Andy was just talking about? Is it an incidental program, meaning very minimal, moderate, advanced, or exceptional? So choose one of those basic categories, and again, select the radio button right next to the answer, and we will take a look at that. And we will also, again, I encourage you to submit written questions because we will have a couple more question breaks before this webcast is over. So let's see here. We've got quite a number of answers here, so I will show that to you. It looks like a majority are kind of in the lower to bottom end, and only a small number said advanced or exceptional. So I guess that's in the range of what we would expect, wouldn't you say, Andy?
Yeah, it always looks like a hydrograph when you look at it sideways.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's what we would expect, and we're hoping from the EPA perspective, I can say that folks under the Phase 2 rules have until about 2008 to fully implement their programs, and so we certainly hope by 2008 that we can move that bump up a little bit towards more moderate and advanced programs. Okay, we have one more polling question. And here we're going to ask you, how much does your municipality spend on stormwater per year per person in your community? So again, thinking about the discussion that Andy just provided us, do you think, and this is just obviously a rough guess, you may not know the exact answer, but something less than $1 per person, all the way up to, say, $4 per person. So just give it your best guess, even if you don't know the exact answer. And we'll take a look at those results as well. Let me see how many people have answered so far. Yes, okay, well, we've got some good range of answers there. Let me show that to you. Quite a number there, below $1 people are estimating. And Andy, what do you think about that?
Well, I would say that if you went back into your community and you took that very detailed table I showed you, and you took indirect costs and you took pieces of people time, you'd be surprised actually how much you do spend. We're always surprised. Because a lot of people do stormwater as an incidental other duty, and if you take 10% of their time plus their indirect costs, overhead costs allocated, it does bump it up, but that's not surprising given the number of very small communities.
So yeah, maybe on sort of first blush you might think that it's relatively low, but if you hunt it around perhaps you would find more. Anyway, again, just in the interest of time, I think we'll move on to the next section. So I will send you to that slide, Andy, and it's all yours again.
Great. Actually, the polling question I wanted to ask is, what beverage are you drinking while you're listening to this talk? But Nichols wouldn't let me do that.
I'm sorry.
Because we in the midsection of the country are having lunch while we're doing this. Okay, let's talk about the S in the SAFE acronym, flexible. I've never seen two stormwater utilities exactly alike. You can pay for anything that looks and smells like stormwater out of a stormwater utility. You know, people said, hot dang, I finally get my Vector machine, leaf pickup. You can use a lot of other fees and secondary funding methods to enhance equity. And one of the really good things about a utility that is not true about other funding methods is that you have a variety of ways of encouraging good performance through the use of crediting or offsetting as a one-time credit, but through the use of crediting. For example, when we set up the first utility in Georgia, Griffin, Georgia, what was really significantly important to them was to encourage the public and private education sector to provide environmental education as part of the Phase 2 permit, because half the people in the community were of school age. And so an agreement was reached that all the schools would teach certain things about water conservation and environmental protection, and they got a credit for doing that. And the reason they got a credit is the overall cost to the city of their Phase 2 program was reduced because they didn't have to provide that program component. It was provided for them. So credits come on two bases. Basis one is I do something like that reduces the community's overall cost of their program. The second basis for a credit is that I do something on my individual site which reduces my use of the stormwater system. That could be detention, it could be infiltration, it could be some other things. But I'm actually reducing the impact of urban development. And most of us know that the impacts really are, if you lump them into three big buckets, it's more volume, higher peak flow, and more pollution. And so if you do something that intersects those three, so for example, in Charlotte, they have a credit that has addressed those three things. Finally, you can geographically base the charges. You can have an urban and a rural services district. You can have charges by watershed to cover various capital costs. You can have urban hotspot charges for certain kinds of communities. Or, for example, you could charge on the basis of not just on impervious area, but you could charge on the basis of nutrient loading. For example, let's say that a significant part of your program, you're a South Carolina coastal community, and shellfish harvesting is important. You're spending a lot of money on a TMDL for nutrients. And so you come up with a way of calculating nutrient loading, and you can factor that into the user fee rate. So it's not just imperviousness that we're looking at. You can specifically take into account other things. Some communities, for example, give a credit to industrial dischargers who have to maintain their own stormwater NPDES permit with the justification that they're performing what might be considered extraordinary to reduce their impact on the system over and above what other people are doing, and so they get a credit for that. Okay, let's go on then with the SAFE, equitable. This is a basic understanding that I think is really key, and that is that every property in your community is serviced by three water systems. You have the drinking water system, you have the wastewater system, and you have the stormwater system. And in each one of those systems, there is something that the property owner would say, that's my system. If my copper line into my house breaks, I call a plumber, I fix it, but I pay somebody money based on how much water I use to keep the whole rest of the system working. Same way with wastewater. If my drain line clogs, I call Roto-Rooter or somebody to fix it. But then I pay on the basis of how much I use that system. I pay a fee to keep the rest of the system going and to service me. Well, stormwater looks and smells and tastes a whole lot more like water and sewer than it does like police and schools and fire. And so paying for stormwater on the basis of property value is nonsensical. And I've probably, I don't know, been in 70 utilities helping set them up or reanalyze or feasibility studies, and I've never yet encountered a group of citizens who didn't think that a user fee method was less fair than a tax-based method. Especially when you explain it this way, everybody goes, oh, of course. Why would I pay for stormwater on the basis of property value? That makes no sense at all. Now, the sword cuts both ways because for example, if you look at that green line across the top, let's say that that's a sewer main. It's in somebody's backyard. If it breaks and they pick up the phone and say, hey, there's smelly stuff bubbling up on my back property line, an unthinkable answer would be, well, that's not on the right-of-way, so I guess good luck. We actually don't solve problems that are off the right-of-way. Well, that's a nonsensical answer for a water system or for a wastewater system, because you don't think of those systems in terms of location, you think of them in terms of ownership. And in the same way, if we're going to go to a stormwater user fee or utility, the community has to begin to make a decision that it's going to begin to take ownership of whatever the public stormwater system is. One of the reasons I always brag about Charlotte is they grasped that idea early on. And one of their driving philosophies was every place that public water flows is a public drainage system, and we will define a program to service that system at some level. And that was a very smart, very liability-reducing decision. It raised some eyebrows around the state and around the country, but in fact, that decision has been one of the significant elements for success of that program. And I just really encourage people that if you're going to set up a utility, but you're still going to tell people you can't fix backyard flooding, you're going to raise eyebrows in another way. So how do we calculate a fee? Typically, there are 100 different rate methodologies. There's a few sort of main categories. The simplest one is just based on this premise: the more you pave, the more you pay. You can see on the screen we have one ERU, or equivalent residential unit. And if you have a commercial venture and it's 40 times as big, and let's say you pay $5 a month, then they pay $200 a month, but they have an opportunity for crediting as well, and credits can become very significant depending on what they do on their property. So it's very, very simple. It's a simple multiplier. Good science bears that out. The one variable that correlates most with volume increase, peak increase, and pollution increase is imperviousness. Not necessarily directly, but it correlates well. For example, imperviousness correlates with population, which correlates with illicit connections, and so on. And so imperviousness has been tested in the courts again and again and again, and has withstood the time. Some people use gross area as well as imperviousness. Some people use an intensive development factor. Some people try to sound very engineering, and they use like a curve number methodology. And there's no right way to do it. The wrong way to do it is to have a rate structure, while technically very complex and very correct, is managerially impossible to execute. The courts have shown a great reluctance to mess with the rate-making authority of local governments if you follow certain things, which leads me to lawsuits. Who will come after you and how? Ask yourself this question: who will think a stormwater utility idea is a bad idea, and they'd even rather have a tax increase? Well, here are the people who tend to sue us as a utility. Tax-exempt properties. It's very, especially if the newspaper starts saying rain tax, it's very hard to get people to understand that it isn't a tax, especially because it comes out of the same billfold that a tax does. But it's a fee. It's a water fee. If you pay a water bill, if you pay an electric bill, you pay a stormwater bill. Convincing federal governments that if they pay a water bill, if they pay an electric bill, they pay a stormwater bill. It's all the same. All-right parkings and Walmarts who have large parking facilities, airports, for example. Sometimes developers don't like it until they realize they don't pay the fee. Owners pay the fee. We always plan to be sued. That's just kind of a motto that we go on. If you plan to be sued on the front end, you'll be ready for a lawsuit on the tail end. And one of the ways you plan to be sued, and this is technical financially as we're going to get, is to recognize that municipal revenue and money comes in 4 basic legal categories. And not understanding these legal categories will get you in a world of hurt as you go forward. Taxes, I think everybody knows, the purpose of a tax is to raise money. There's typically no mandatory association between where the money comes from and where it goes. There are some earmark taxes. But generally, anything that's legal or you can get away with, you can use the taxes. Exactions are a different legal animal. An exaction is a privilege to use. For example, when someone develops and you require them to put in detention pond and drainage infrastructure, that's an exaction. A franchise fee is an exaction. For example, communities charge the cable television companies a fee to use their right-of-way. Some communities charge stormwater utilities a fee to use their right-of-way, or water and wastewater. So an exaction is a privilege for the privilege of developing, you have to develop stormwater infrastructure on your property. Many communities with good master plans also make people buy into a larger regional capital improvement program into which their stormwater will eventually drain, even if they put stuff on their site. And those are all franchise or exactions. Then you have an assessment. An assessment, you must show a direct and special benefit. It typically comes with capital construction. Let's say you put a regional detention facility in a neighborhood, and you charge people on the basis of how much their property value is benefited. The measurement of that benefit for stormwater is often very indirect measurement, even though you're trying to prove that it's a direct and special benefit. Some utilities in California are set up on the basis of benefit assessment. New York is looking at that. Sarasota went to Supreme Court on a benefit-based utility. But generally, a utility is the 4th of these, and that is it's a service charge. It's a water bill, sewer bill, looks like that. You do not have to show benefit. It is not a tax, and it is not based on the privilege to use. it is based solely on the cost of providing goods and services, or not goods and services, activities, programs and services, divided by the total rate base. So it's not a tax. Some communities have gone to court and lost because they thought they were setting up service charges, but they ended up setting up a tax-based system, and the court said, you have stated in your documentation that you're out of money and you need to raise revenue, and this looks like a tax, you're calling it a fee, you don't have authority to set up something like this, give the money back with interest. That was the situation Atlanta, for example, found themselves in. So it's very, very important as you go forward, and especially the smaller communities, as you're looking at sort of multiple ways to raise money, that you don't mix and match these four methods and think you're doing a service charge and in fact you're not, and then you go to court and you lose, and so on. There have been a number of Supreme Court challenges, a number more court challenges. There's always sort of 7 different reasons why people take you to court, and I don't really have time to go into those. I'm not trying to tease you. You can look at the NASM document, and it has a pretty good discussion of all of that. David Birchmore did a great job on that. Let's move on to the next polling question then, and go on to Nikos.
Okay, very good, Andy. We have a quick question here, and then we'll answer some more questions from the audience. Our first polling question here is, does your municipality have a stormwater utility? And let's see if we can get it to come up here. Here we go. So there's 4 choices. You can answer yes, you have one already, no, you don't. You're seriously considering one, or you've got one in progress and you're developing it. So we'll take just a second again to answer that question, and we will see what the results are. Oops, maybe I went too fast there. Let's see. Let's see if we can do that. Here we go. Okay. So, whoops. Not sure what mistake I just made. Let's see. Well, I goofed that up. Maybe Matt can straighten that out for me. Okay, here we go. So we've got 14% said yes, 42% no. A high number there are seriously considering it, 35%. So I guess that means more business for you, Andy. And
well, there's a lot of good folks out there doing this kind of work now. So
yeah, well, I just had to get that dig in.
I know you did.
There's always a little bit.
Comments of EPA are not necessarily the.
Yes, exactly. There's a disclaimer on my comments too. All right, let's answer some questions from the audience. First of all, Don in Monroe, city of Monroe, would like to know what you think the average ratio of stormwater personnel to the population is generally needed to sustain a moderate program. Do you have any ideas there approximately?
Oh my gosh, I don't. I certainly don't think in those terms, because stormwater is done so many different ways. You know, some people privatize a lot of it. It just, boy, that's a tough one. I always go on dollars spent, because then you can allocate your dollars. Nobody's incredibly more efficient or less efficient, incredibly more or less personnel. One of the points I really want to make is really avoid sort of cookie cutter programs, because they're all so different. Boy, did I duck that question. I don't have a good answer for that.
That's fair enough.
That's not a metric that we use as personnel per population.
All right,
maybe
well,
it should be, but it's not.
Yeah, well, Don, I would recommend that you look at the dollars per population, and then you could maybe make an extrapolation as to how many staff members that would buy you. Let's see, a number of people have asked this. Andy, when you said that the average fee was about $375, what units were you using, and how often are these fees billed? Is that a monthly fee, a quarterly fee, a yearly fee? What's the $375 relate to?
Well, that's a great question. I'm sorry I didn't clarify that. That would be $375 per equivalent residential unit per month. So that's a monthly bill for a typical household, and non-residential properties would be billed multiples of that based on the size of their impervious area. Let's say that a typical house is 3,000 square feet of impervious area, and if your non-residential property is 10 times that big, then you would pay 10 times that monthly fee.
Gotcha. Okay, that clarifies it. And we have a question from Kevin from the city of St. Cloud. Do you find? Yes, exactly. Do you find that once the driving projects, which I assume he means are the capital projects for stormwater, are completed, is there a resentment towards still having to pay the fee?
You know what? Jeb can answer that question better than I can, and he will, I think, during his talk. But the reality is that very few communities, I think maybe Bellevue, Washington is starting to ratchet their fee down, but typically the backlog of complaints that have not been called in because there's never a good answer, it is years and years and years until you actually get the stormwater infrastructure system in some semblance of function. Most people just look the other way when they look at the capital need because it's so huge. GASB 34 is making a lot of people open their eyes to the horrid condition of their stormwater system and the potential backlog. I don't know that people resent the fee any more or less before or after. I don't think that people track whether the capital program is actually done or not. I don't know that that happens. But I tell you what does happen, and maybe Jeb again can comment on this, is that when you build successful projects and you build multiple successful projects, it's a really good idea to advertise that fact in a number of different ways. And you'll find, for example, in Nashville, we were actually designing and building something like 6 to 10 projects a week. Lots and lots of letters were coming in thanking the political leadership for finally solving these problems. I know Jeb has a similar story out of Charlotte.
Did you want to address that?
Yeah, I think, one, I don't know if we'll ever get our capital. We have made a huge amount of headway. This is Jeb Blackwell from Charlotte. But what I would add is that as we looked at increasing our fee, just an interesting measure on that, because we were building so many successful projects in a lot of communities, a lot of neighborhoods in the city, we had elected officials from a group called Citizens for Effective Government, and their view was, you know, less government's better. They never met a tax increase that they didn't go for. We had a series of 10% increases in our fee, and to catch up with that backlog, and even those Citizens for Effective Government council members voted for it. Our votes were 11-0. You could have voted against it, still gotten the increase because the others were going to do it, and you could have said you voted against it. But there was enough positive impact in their districts that they supported the stormwater program.
Okay, very good. All right, we're going to go back to the presentation. Jeb, if you'd mute your phone again.
Yes.
And Andy, just as a reminder about the time, we do have the ability to go over a few minutes. And if we need to do that, we can extend a little bit beyond the 3 o'clock hour, but you might want to consider summarizing a little bit, and I'll turn it back to you.
That was a good hint.
Sorry. Subtle, right?
Yeah, well,
I don't think the audience picked up on that.
Well, I apologize to Jeb on the front end that they took 10 minutes of his time. But I will shoot to be done on time and under budget as a good consultant would, and so I'll shoot to be done in about 7 minutes. So we're going to talk about how you set one of these up, and we're going to skip over some of the philosophy and get right into it, and that is the question of how do I implement a stormwater utility. What we're trying to do in a community is we're trying to bring about change, and bringing about change has everything to do with defining 3 things. How dissatisfied, or how can I frame the dissatisfaction that we have with the status quo concerning stormwater and surface water cleanness and flooding and so on. Secondly, what kind of a vision can I create for change that's compelling? And thirdly, what is my plan to get there? And when we talk about establishing a stormwater utility and the process that you use to set one up, we use the phrase due diligence, and it's a legal term, but in reality what we're talking about is being diligent in setting up a stormwater utility in 5 key areas. And let me just touch on those 5 key areas right now. And since I can't go forward, I'm going to go on manual, and we'll just kind of keep going. And that is, point number 1 is I want to create a compelling program. And that is, what I'm selling is a program. I'm not selling out of money. I'm not selling anything else. What I'm selling is a program. And so point number 1 is, what am I selling? Will people buy it? What is the compelling case? What are the needs? How do I frame them? How do I go after both right brain and left brain needs of people? The second point of due diligence has to do with governance and intermunicipal consensus. This isn't an issue unless you're doing a utility that intersects several entities, although every utility intersects some multiple entities in some ways. But that part of due diligence is, how do I get the right people on the bus? How do I get them seated right? How do I get them sitting in the right seats? And how do I get us marching together, you know, kind of singing Kumbaya, talking about stormwater together? We're working right now in 5 settings that have multiple entities. One has as many as 50 different entities. And that process of including people appropriately, including them early, building joint vision is a complex issue, but it's extremely important. I've seen several utilities where in the 11th hour, people who you thought were on the bus rebelled against the process, went out in the public saying that they didn't feel included, and the utilities failed. So point 1 is program, point 2 is governance, point 3 is political and public education and support. It's extremely important that you're able to raise that support, that you understand who the stakeholders are. There are numerous publics out there, and that we understand who those publics are, and why, what their particular interest in. Some people might be interested, for example, in pollution. Some are interested in flooding. A flooded neighborhood has a particular interest. Developers have an interest, and so on. Your political leadership has an interest. No one wants to fall on the knife for stormwater. It's typically not that important to a lot of people. And so due diligence, having a public education plan, a process, what to do when it hits the fan, having good materials. For example, we've had a mayor interviewed by the media say, well, it's just going to be $1 a month. And that was incredibly hard to overcome when we all knew it was going to be about $3.25. And so early on, for example, we'll give everybody who may say anything in public about this thing a frequently asked questions, front and back, bulleted list that kind of says, here are the key questions you're going to be asked, and we'd appreciate it if you try to answer the questions this way. The fourth thing is financial due diligence. That is, there is a certain process that you go through to set up a stormwater utility, and it has to do with the establishment of policies. That establishment of policies rotates on through to the establishment of a rate structure and what that structure is going to look like, and that rotates on through to a rate study and a rate ordinance and implementation steps and so on. When you go to court, one of the things that they're going to ask is, was it fair and reasonable, and do people pay in proportion to their use of the system, or is it arbitrary and capricious, and what people pay bears little resemblance to their use of the system? And that's one of the tests for user fee. And it's all about bringing out a stack of financial analyses that, you know, I've actually been in court, and we brought out a stack, and the lawyer said, fine, let's move on, because they realized that all those questions were fully discussed and fully implemented. The worst thing is to say, we're out of money, about $2 will do, let's go forward. That is a recipe for losing in court. The problem with, for example, charging people less than the amount of money you need, or what some people do is that they arbitrarily cap the amount that, for example, non-residential pay. The problem with doing that is it's a little bit like crack cocaine. You get some amount of money fast and easy. You don't have to go through a lot of effort to get that amount of money. But when the calls come in and complaints start coming in about flooding and so on, you don't really have any basis. You don't have enough revenue to solve their problems. When you arbitrarily cap your fee, for example, I've seen utilities where they say, well, nobody pays more than $100 a month. Well, the reality is that for a normal type of a city that's not just a bedroom community, 2/3 of your revenue doesn't come from residential, it comes from commercial. And if you arbitrarily cap commercial, then you're going to arbitrarily stunt the ability of your utility to do what it needs to do, and the utility will actually take on sort of a bad reputation. And the reason will be is because we bailed on our financial due diligence to come up with a funding package that actually meets the needs of the system, and so on. And finally, the last due diligence is database. I know of a utility that decided it was a county, and they decided to bill on the basis of zoning. Well, I don't know about you, but zoning where I live and where I've worked rarely reflects what's on the ground. And so the amounts that were billed didn't reflect the actual development on the site. There was no good phone number to call, and they just about lost the utility. Well, in fact, they did lose the utility. They fired the consultant, fired the county engineer, sent the money back with an apology letter. I know Indianapolis had a significant problem with their billing database to the point where it was in the newspapers every week, and it's been solved, and now it's a very successful utility up there. But again, that sorting out that database side and making sure that it's accurate, that customers feel well served, that when the phone rings, the answer is stormwater utility, can I help you, and not, what, you called here? There is a process of doing this. We sometimes call it a 3-step process. Step 1 is sort of before you dive off the high dive, does it make sense? We actually, in our firm, have something called a DIMS study, which is a 1-day crash course in should we even go forward or not. If you came out to the StormCon, we're going to do a DIMS in the afternoon for everybody who's there, just to kind of show you sort of how it works. Secondly is a feasibility study, and the feasibility study really answers the questions, what are we spending, what are the problems, how have others people solve them, how should we solve them, what will it cost, and how should we pay for it. It's really an action plan. It's a business plan. And it makes a lot of sense if you don't know if you should go forward or not. A feasibility study can't fail, because if you decide you shouldn't go forward, the study was a success. If you decide you should go forward, the study was a success. And so a feasibility study is just that. You're exploring feasibility. It's great for citizens, 6 meetings with citizen group, and you'll have all the answers that you need. And finally, that is a fairly complex bar chart slide that shows all of it shows 4 of the 5 tracks. It's sort of a typical utility, but I really want to caution you that you should not use some graph somewhere and just follow that. Every utility is different. Every path through a utility is a little bit different. This hits some of the highlights, but there are other things that are very key. But the point is, if you try to establish a stormwater utility and you fail, you'll probably need 5 to 7 years before you get another shot at it. Let's say your utility is going to generate $1 million a year. Failure to go forward with utility is a $5 to $7 million opportunity cost. That's the actual lost revenue from failing to establish it. Setting up a utility, going through all the proper steps, doing all the public awareness, doing an appropriate rate study, dealing well with stakeholders, doing a good job with the database, at the most will cost you a couple months of revenue from the utility. So when you look at the opportunity cost for cutting corners, or you look at the cost of doing it right, to me, even if I wasn't a consultant who did this, it's a good investment to take your time, to do it right, to get the right people, the right staff people, the right outside people helping you set the thing up. and plan to do it just once and do it right, and then you'll have a revenue stream that will carry your program on into the future. I think I'm going to skip over the slides on how to fail flawlessly. I think they're pretty self-explanatory. The final slide there, it really just talks about the post-mortem reasons that people have given when their stormwater utility has not gone forward. And they have everything to do with short-circuiting the process, short-circuiting community involvement, not really being able to explain their program or having a rate that's so complicated or seems inequitable, not preparing the elected officials to get phone calls. They're going to get phone calls. What you want to do is arm them with good answers that they believe in. And finally, just trying to do something very quickly and conveniently rather than realizing that you're setting up a whole new entity, and thinking through the right questions and the right answers is really important.
Well, I'm going to give a quick overview of what we dealt with in Charlotte. A lot of it will touch, I think, on and dealt with some of the real issues that Andy did a good job, I think, talking about. And we had Charlotte went through a lot of the issues that many cities did. One thing is a lot of our infrastructure was very old. Was built, a lot of it was from WPA, from the 30s, and some of it was older than that. And so we spent about 80 years or more backing ourselves into a problem because it wasn't really maintained. The other problem that we had that was a big driver in Charlotte was that we had a tremendous amount of growth from the 80s to 2005. I think we've added about 350,000 people, not to the metro, but to the city limits. Some of that through annexation, but a tremendous amount was growth. So we had a really old and deteriorating infrastructure. The North Carolina law was the responsibility of the property owners. So we had what I would call a community asset that needed to be solved as a system. You can't fix it on one property if it's bad on all the other ones around it and serve the whole community, but it was an individual responsibility. And having a community asset that individuals have to do, especially when the solutions were so expensive, really caused our system to not be maintained. That was really bad infrastructure for us. Going on next slide there to turn the tide slide if you're trying to keep up. In October of 1998, we had a veteran council at that point. They had been through a lot of big floods. They had seen a lot of citizens show up in front of them who had terrible problems. Those citizens looked like victims. The problems looked unsolvable within the citizens' financial means through any hope. And so the council, after seeing that a number of years, started saying we need to look at a more comprehensive way to address this. And what they did then is authorized staff to go study a utility supported by a fee. So that led us, they also appointed a citizen task force. And so staff and we hired consultants at that point, including Andy, to begin a study to collect data and figure out what we needed to do going forward. One of the things that we did was a survey of 500 registered voters. I don't normally like to read slides, but I'm going to go through it because I don't know how many people can see this. And we had 98% of our citizens believe that water quality should be a high priority. We were doing very little to nothing on that area. 76% of them said the drainage system didn't get the attention it needed. 40% said there was a drainage problem in their neighborhood, and 18% had a drainage problem on their property. And that led to 60%, which is close to 2/3 of our citizens, indicating in that survey, based on 500 people, that they were willing to pay a service charge for a stormwater program. Another question that we needed to try and deal with is how much might this cost to address so that we could start talking about what the size of the solution needed to be. We were at that time in the 230 or so square mile area. You certainly couldn't assess all of that. That would be a huge job. We took a 1 6 square mile basin and figured out how many problems and how much system we had in that. And that basin had newly developed area and some old area in it, so we could get a sort of a cross section of the community. And taking what we got from that and extrapolating it, we came out that we had about 2,400 miles of storm drainage, 170 storm drains. 10,000 of those were over 80 years old. 50,000 were over 30 years old. About 2,500 were broken. Close to 10,000 were blocked. And if you took the cost of fixing that 6 square mile area and extrapolated over the city, we said $1 to $500 million to fix. And what we found later is $500 million was more like it, or maybe more. We were low on that number, and that gets back to we'll talk about flexibility as one of the things we want to be sure to deal with in this. Another thing you have to deal with is development of a fee model. In Charlotte, we were looking at an impervious area basis, which was, as Andy discussed, is where you pay based on how much impervious area you have, how much you're contributing to the problem. That's what you want to contribute to the solution. And so a fee model that is a thoughtful fee model needs to have an ability to put in assumptions like growth and impervious that you're going to see over the future, so you can project your program out. Now, operating cost projections, capital needs projections, what you think your future interest rates and borrowing rates are going to be, because those have a big impact if you're doing, especially as we did, a lot of debt financing because we were trying to front-end load the program. You also need to be able to input your basic data, which is current impervious, number of accounts, operating costs, capital cost, and your service of debt, and any other revenue you have. And we had some contributions of other money. There was a city paid a fee in lieu of on it rather than pay a direct impervious calculation. And from that, you should be able to come up with what your ERU needs to be, your equivalent residential unit rate, that monthly payment from each house, which then is the same basis used for your commercial. And for us, the idea of that ERU, for those who don't, you don't want to try to, if you're doing impervious, it's one thing to measure all your commercial properties, to actually go and measure them or do it from aerial photographs. But trying to measure all your houses is just not practical and really leads to a huge amount of variability in your fee. So we basically said residential units are paying this rate, and then the commercial ones, we actually measured them. And so, and then you had interest revenue, you had, and then you had debt service and those other things. You need to be able to come up with what those costs are going to be to have a solid fee model, which will give you what you have to deal with it. A big public policy issue for us was dealing with the question of whether this should be a property tax thing or whether this should be a fee thing. And when we came up with what we thought we needed in terms of money, we came up with an ERU amount. And I have two slide examples for those of you who are looking. The first one is the commercial. And the one shown at the bottom there is Nations Bank, which is a very tall office building in uptown Charlotte. It's over 60 stories. For them, it's only 1.9 acres, so their monthly fee based on ERUs as we were starting was $120. For them, the property tax equivalent for us would be about 6 cents per 100 assessed, so it'd be $15,000. So they were a winner by being tall and low on impervious. A loser would be Eastland Mall, which is a mall in this area, lots of parking around it. Their monthly fee based on ERUs would be close to $5,000. The 6 cent property tax, which would generate the equivalent amount of revenue, was about $3,000. So they're winners and losers when you decide which way to do this. We feel like a fee was the appropriate way to do it because, as Andy described, having your stormwater program, which really needs to be strategic in there fighting with saving babies for the fire department or police, it's not, for us, wasn't a reliable enough revenue stream. The residential side, what we found is that that the monthly fee, the flat ERU rate of $355 is what we came to, versus the property tax charge. For a $71,000 house, it would be equal. $3.55 was the monthly fee, and 6 cents on the property tax would do the same thing. So for a $150,000 house, their property tax share of that would be $7.50. And the median house in Charlotte at the time this was started was a little over $150. So for most residential folks, the property tax would be double that. As Andy had described in his, using a property tax shifts the cost pretty significantly. When you look at that, what you see is that for the average homeowner, even with the tax deduction, which is one thing people talked about, is making it deductible, it costs more for them to put it on property tax than it does to put it on their as a monthly fee. The monthly fee, one thing we found is only a small percentage of people itemize if you call HR Block or whatever, they'll tell you the percentage of people that itemize, so they actually get their home deduction, is relatively small. And also the fact that for us, our property tax is over 50% of our total, is over 50% residential, where for commercial, as Andy said, it's the vast majority of a stormwater fee comes from commercial. And when you throw in all those nonprofits, churches, and so forth that wouldn't pay property tax, there's a big shift to homeowners if you use property tax versus a fee. And for us, there was some relevance to that. And one other thing I'd say is we had a second tier on our ERU. Almost all of our houses are at that single-family ERU you see there, which is 2,500 square feet. we had, for houses under 2,000 square feet, which are the smallest houses in the neighborhood and tended to be lower income, we had a 68% charge on that. So it was more like $2.40 or 50 cents is what a small home would pay. So that example there, that's a $50,000 house, hopefully would have fallen in that lower fee rate. I just hit next and it didn't push, so maybe I'm not able to push it. Can somebody push the slide?
Jeb will give it a try.
Very good. The problem with impervious approach, there is a little bit of a regressive nature to it. A wealthy household pays the same as a less wealthy. But again, you're paying based on your contribution to the problem. We in Charlotte, we charged ourselves for public property because in North Carolina, we don't have to do that. But we did charge an equivalent fee to what our impervious would have been, but we make a payment in lieu of fee, and that hasn't kept up in Charlotte. That has risen at a lower rate than everybody else has done. And then the state of North Carolina has a lot of impervious here because of roads, but North Carolina, they're pretty grouchy about paying a fee. Their view is when they're providing state roads in our community that's sort of a service to us, and for local government to, from their perspective, balance the budget by charging them a fee for providing roads to us. That didn't go over with them very well, and the NCDOT in North Carolina is not to be taken lightly. The next slide, the Stormwater Task Force made some recommendations to council, and I think this is real important. What they did there is they set some large goals, some big goals, and that helps, I think, you to sell this politically. Of course, the first recommendation was to fund stormwater services through stormwater revenue, which was a fee-based system. The next was that we distribute the cost to ratepayers in accordance to their contribution. The big scary one was address the backlog of remedial repairs within 10 years. And those are not our capital projects, but there were a huge number of what we call maintenance projects that had either house flooding or structural failure or a failure to the system that threatened somebody's house. Those were big problems. Those were our A's, and we had a lot of those problems. And when we looked at how many we had, we said, wow, if we go hard, we can deal with that in 10 years. Now, as a public policy piece, you go, wow, 80 years of problems we're going to try and solve in 10. That was a very aggressive program. The tough conversation is you've got a citizen who may have had a problem for 10 years or more before you had a fee that's flooding in their house. Now they're paying a fee and they call you and say, when are you going to fix my problem? And you say, well, we'll be out there sometime in the next 10 years. That's a really interesting customer service conversation because it doesn't meet expectations. But it was a big challenge, and I will get later to, we had success with that. We wanted to complete master planning of our capital program within 5 years, and of course work on water quality. The stormwater program started. There was a vote to do that in June. That was a huge vote for the council. You can see the editorial comments there from the Observer, which was, wow, this is a monumental decision instead of a lot of the smaller things council often discussed. At least that was staff's perception on that. So that they voted to start the program on January 1 of 1993. And then next slide, please. There were 10-year goals for the program. One was that we're going to address the worst problems first. We're going to deal with public safety issues, flooding of structures, and major structural failures. We're going to deal with that 10-year backlog and improve water quality. That is some stuff we've kind of talked about, but we had a major adjustment in that. That was in '93. 3 years later, which is about when I arrived at the program, we found that wasn't working for us. There were some real flaws in that. It was an extremely reactive program because really our program was driven by the worst problems. It wasn't us looking strategically at what we wanted to do in the system and managing the system proactively. This was us trying to us responding to whatever citizen complaint was and whatever the worst flooding problem was. Another problem we had as we arrived in '96 is we realized, as I mentioned earlier, that the cost of improving this and the number of complaints was way more than we expected. And so we made a pledge to council that we would deal with that problem in 10 years. We further made a pledge that we wouldn't come to them with a rate increase for the first 6 years of the program. So here, 3 years in, we realized that we needed to double the size of the program to meet that 10-year commitment. So we went to the council and said, we need to come to you. You've got two choices, council. Either you can do 10% increases to the program and do some serious bond and debt financing to double the program, or we're not going to meet that 10-year goal. And in Charlotte, we hadn't had a tax increase until this year since 1984. They do not raise taxes around here, and so for them to vote to do that was a tremendous affirmation of confidence in how we had done with the program, which was hitting very aggressively on getting the program started and making it run and solving problems, and so that we were hearing a lot of positive stuff about the program, and they were as well. And so that a real key is to those maintenance projects was getting out there and doing projects early. If you put your weight on the capital, realize that it might have been 2 or 3 or 4 years before we were starting to finish projects. And when you're charging a fee and it's going into an account someplace and you're not building projects, that's the kind of thing that gets public works folks in a lot of trouble. They weren't giving us that money as a savings account. They were giving that money and looking for us to convert it to projects. And so we actually did incurred a little debt to award a construction contract and have a design done. So on January 1 of '93, when the program started, we were in some people's backyards digging, and we had the media out there, and we made a big deal that you're paying fee today and we're starting work today. And so we hammered that hard and early. Let's see here. And the other big adjustments we made in '96, if you can go to the next slide, we really came up with what we called a balanced portfolio, and that is we couldn't just work on those worst projects, because one thing that happened, if you came into the program with a minor problem in January of '93 when the program started and said, I want to get on the waiting list, if you called quick enough, you might be number 3 on the waiting list, but all you had was a small problem in your ditch. We had thousands of calls that came in those first few years, thousands of them. Well, so you might have been number 3 on the waiting list on January 1st, but a year or two later, you're number 3,000 on the list, and you were moving backwards forever. And so we continued to work on those A's and B's at a high level, but we also started working on other projects as well. And so when we doubled the program, we increased our rate of working on those worst problems. We also started, the slide's not up yet, right below that it's called channel projects. It's not up for me, I apologize. But to keep other people moving forward so they could at least see that their problems were going to be solved. In addition, there were a slew of other city projects going on in neighborhoods, transportation projects, transit projects, and the developers were doing projects in the area as well. And the developers, the Chamber of Commerce Land Use sent us a note that one of the things they were supportive of the stormwater program is that they were telling us that when they were coming in for a rezoning, the number one objection to rezonings to increase density had been transportation, and traffic will get worse. But a lot of citizens would say to the council, it's going to add increased flooding in our neighborhood. And so we instead of, when somebody comes in for a rezoning and with the reactive program we had, we said, well, wait till they start flooding you, then call us and get on the list, and in 10 years we'll come fix your problem. Somehow that didn't sell with the council. The citizens didn't get happy with increased density in their area. And as a city, we have got some sprawl problems, so we wanted to increase density. So we set up an economic development program that lets us do joint venture problems with projects with developers that are proactive. When the developer comes in to do his project, we go in with him and upsize the needed infrastructure downstream. And then we wanted to increase our pollution control, and we added a stream restoration program. Let's see here, we're a couple of slides behind. Let's roll up to the one that's headed with infrastructure. It's called Balanced Portfolio Capital Strategy on the side. This is sort of a summary of what we've completed to date. In flood control, we've completed 52 projects. We have 35 projects underway right now. Expended to date is $113 million. Our average project has increased 83% from 2004. They used to be about $3 million, and now about $5.5 million. Repairs to storm drainage, which are all of those maintenance projects I talked about earlier, we have resolved 25,200 roughly requests for service. We have about 6,000 still open, getting to that question of what do you do when the backlog's gone. It's hard to conceive the backlog going away. We have a graph later on that'll kind of illustrate that. We've expended about $100 million to date, $91 million. And the cost of those has risen. 2004, the average request for service was about $16,000. Now they're up about 25% to around $20,000. On pollution control, water quality projects, we've completed 13 projects at about $2.5 million. On stream restoration, we've done 5 projects, total value of about $5.8 million. On our collaboration projects, working with other projects, what was really tough is that they come in and do a neighborhood project or a transportation project, and it might create problems, or it might just be they would tear the neighbor up and do theirs, and then a year later, or even a month or two later, we might show up with a stormwater project. What really needed to happen is that work all get done together, but of course that would mean pulling those out of the priority list and doing them in the order that they arrived. Great. So they're the neighborhood projects. When we go in and do work in a neighborhood through other bond funds, Stormwater has participated in 35 neighborhood projects at $5.8 million expended to date. Transportation projects, but that doesn't mean that we're doing the drainage improvements under the street when somebody's doing a street project. That means we're doing a street project. We're upsizing a culvert that may have passed under a street, and now where it used to be attenuating or damming up or detaining the water upstream from some people downstream, now enlarging that culvert under the street, we're now going to blow them away. This is Stormwater coming in and saying we're going to go downstream and make improvements there. We're going to work with that project to make it so that we're not flooding people. And then we're working with transit on projects too, 1 complete, 2 in process, $4.5 million. And the ED projects, as I said, those are the joint ventures with developers, and that's been a good win for us in that one of our goals there is to leverage our money 2 to 1 with developers. A developer who comes in and says, I want to do this thing and it's going to add to the flooding downstream, we tell them the on-site improvements, that's all on you, that's the normal developer cost, but we need you to participate in solving the downstream projects, and so we get developer participation to work with us on those downstream projects. And that program started slowly, but we're starting to see more and more activity in it. We have completed a handful of projects, but we've got more underway right now than we have at any previous time. Only done 3.2 million of those at this point. Now let's see here. And here you can see our cash expenditures from 93 when the program began up to 97, FY07 or 06. That's where we are currently. The vast majority of our program now is capital. When we first started, we were kind of gearing all that up. There's a fixed amount in there that's operating. And one thing I'll say about that operating is that some of what we carry in operating, other people might call capital. We have contracts with other government agencies that we carry in operating, but we pay street maintenance. We pay street maintenance to do maintenance of the storm drainage system in the streets. And remember, the city pays an in lieu fee. So where NCDOT doesn't pay fee for their streets, we don't fix NCDOT's, the state DOT's road drainage problems. But the City of Charlotte does do maintenance on its streets, and for that impervious area, there's a calculated fee that doesn't quite equal the. Actually, it's a fair amount at this point short of the total impervious. When we started the program, it was on it, but we haven't increased the impervious calculation for the city. But as the rate has gone up, that city payment in lieu of has gone up, and so we also pay the county. About $1.2 million for water quality, $4 million to street maintenance for their work, and we contract with USGS for about $300,000. Excuse me, getting a little dry there. Long-term fee paying. What you see there is, you might remember at the beginning I mentioned that we had said there was going to be 6 years without a fee increase. We didn't make but 3 of that because we started really getting an understanding of the size of the problem. But then instead of 6 years of 10% increases, we beat our target, which was to eliminate that backlog of worst problems. In 10 years, we completed it in 9 years. So we only had 5 years of 10% increases. Only 5 years of 10% increases. Sounds kind of funny. But because that's a pretty aggressive increase rate, if you ask me. But that was a huge success, and everybody felt really good about that. And the big thing that means, though, is if you're in that category of worst priority projects, where you have house flooding and really big rain events, if you call us and you have house flooding and really big rain events, and we still get new ones a large number of them, and we'll see a slide about that later, but they're still coming in. Hopefully, before the next big rain event, right now we're running at about 12 months on those, but hopefully before the next big rain event, we can get out there and solve your problem. So when you call in with that big complaint, that big problem, that's a more reasonable level of service. You will flood once, and hopefully we'll get to you before you flood again. Our backlog on the low priority projects is still very, very long on the channel projects. We'll see that in a moment. And you can see what has happened with our single-family residential rate. And you see we began at 212, and it has risen pretty steadily, and we anticipate it continuing to rise. Right now, our total rate is more than the 212. The 212 is the city portion of the rate. There's a fixed portion of the rate. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to move the slide. I beg your pardon. There's a city portion of our rate. There's a fixed portion of our rate, which is the cost of processing bills and the billing process, receiving and sending out those bills. And then there's a county portion which covers the major systems. So the total rate for FY07 is $7.10, and for us right now. So let's see here. And this shows our request for service backlog. And what you see is that of the high priorities, they are still coming in at several hundred a year. And we have a small backlog there. But we work through those relatively, at this point we're having about 12 months on them. But there's a huge backlog of the low priorities that qualify for service but are not at the high priority level. So again, speaking to that, the question about what do you do when you deal with the backlog, I would love to try to figure out what to do with that problem, but that's not the one that we get to try and solve here. See if I can get that to change. There we go. All right. Our goals still at this point, where we'd say the large long-term goals for Charlotte's program, are to reduce our unresolved high priority requests. We'd like to get it below 12 months. We are still trying to evolve towards being more proactive than reactive, and we have made some progress on that, but still are not there yet. We need to continue to meet federal mandates, meet or exceed at this point. We've gotten council over just the last year or two to change their policy from meet federal mandates to some higher end goals, which get into exceeding federal mandates, and then collaborate on community initiatives. And financial goals, we want to keep our funding lined up with needs, and then we want to. Right now, we're still heavily bond financed, and we want to reduce that and become a more pay-as-you-go program where our fee increases are more lined up with inflation. I'm at the last two slides here, which really is a summary on lessons learned, and I can probably go through those pretty quickly. Just politically speaking, what I would say is the first thing you have to do if you're trying to get these things pushed through, what we did in Charlotte, was gather our allies. The Chamber of Commerce was an interesting ally because of the issues developers were having the developers were a very mixed bag on that, and I say the run-of-the-mill developers were not in favor of any new fee, but some of the higher-end ones realized we had a problem there. The neighborhoods, the newspaper was on board with us, and we had a number of council members who were receptive to the idea. We had one council member who was a strong leader on the council who really was a champion for it, and I think that's an important key. You got to develop your key policies and principles, and those need to be things that resonate with people. And those strong basic goals I showed, I think those speak to that, and those certainly resonated here in Charlotte. Get your infrastructure data early and stay flexible on it. We spent a huge amount of effort gathering that 6 square miles, but then we found out we way underestimated our problem, and that was very difficult for us. And then expect the unexpected, in addition to the fact that you probably see a lawsuit, and we had a few of those here in North Carolina. Charlotte specifically didn't get sued, but the ones that went to the Supreme Court, those affect everybody. And construction costs have gone up much more than expected, and service requests were then and still are much higher than we had expected. Think long-term. Don't make short-term budget decisions that have a negative consequence. I think Andy's point about don't cap fee for people or stuff like that, those are the kinds of things that you hope in the short term will make it more palatable, but you can really regret those. I think the city contribution was an example of us where we really tried to think in long term on our program because it helps you with the fairness issue. We wanted to build a solid financial modeling that kept us flexible and let us deal with changes because we ended up with changes. We major restructuring the program in '96 in addition to dealing with changes that we didn't come up with. And you have to have a lot of quick winners, getting out fast with some remedial repairs and doing some news blitz on that, making sure that people know they're doing it. One thing that we did that was real important is the people who were on the waiting list for service, we had a regular newsletter that went out to them that showed where all we were working and showed that stuff was happening because we didn't want them to just think that they were lost. And one other big push we did in the late 90s that was very difficult for our staff was to send to each person on the waiting list an estimate of when we were going to get to them in terms of quarters. It didn't say we'll be out there January 3rd of 2 years from now. It said in the first quarter 2 years from now, we will be at your house. And those were hard commitments and they were scary for our staff because so much unknown stuff had happened in terms of scope and all that. But it was really important to have those folks so they can make plans as far as if they were trying to sell their house or whatever. And so, and then we provided options to the council. For example, we said to them, we don't know if you want to do 10% increases or if you which is a violation of one of our promises, or if you want to do not make the 10-year commitment, here's the implications of each. And we just told them, you know, here's what happened and here's what we have to do to deal with it. When we set the program up in the first place, we offered 3 levels of program. We said, you know, you can do a bare MPDS program, you can get into capital, or you can get in a lot. And interestingly, they went for the big bite. They went for a serious capital program. So. Those are our major lessons learned, and I think that gets us to the end of that. I hope I didn't talk too fast there.
No, I think that's great, Jeb. So now we have some questions, and I think the questions could probably be answered by Andy or you, Jeb. So is Andy still with us?
I'm still here.
Great. Okay. Well, just feel free to jump in and either one of you take a shot or both at any of these questions. First one here is from Vina with a Cumberland River Compact. What would be the advantage or disadvantage of setting up a special or dedicated revenue fund versus a stormwater utility?
Those are kind of mixed terms, and different cities and different states have different terms. But when you look at how a financial manager would manage this, and Jeb might be able to answer this better than I, but really you sort of have 2 choices within most city governments. You have a special revenue fund, or you have a enterprise fund. It used to be those are fairly different. One, an enterprise fund is basically a municipal corporation. It's a proprietary function of government, and special revenue fund was just a dedicated fund within the general fund, within general government. Because of GASB 34, the accounting works almost the same now with both of those. And so there really is no advantage to setting it up one way or another. It just depends on how the local government likes to do that and what the finance director is comfortable with. The only element that's important is that the funds are segregated and dedicated.
Okay, good. If we have a second question here from Fred, and he would like to know, how do you account for stormwater flow from totally undeveloped properties? And if so, how do you charge those properties?
The answer from Charlotte is that we don't charge them. You pay based on your contribution to the problem. And so if your project property is undeveloped, you have no impervious, you pay nothing. And as Andy described earlier, we also have a fee credit, so you can pay nothing. If it's 50% based on your total volume of flow off of impervious, 25% on peak, and 25% on water quality. So if you put a measure in that addresses a water quality issue, you would qualify for up to 25% of your fee off. If you completely mitigate your property's impervious impact, so it's undeveloped, even though it has development on it, say putting in ponds or whatever, you you could have a zero fee in Charlotte.
All right, great. And Melissa would
Wait a
like.
minute,
Go ahead, Andy.
Let me try to address that more
Sure.
generally, and that is that one of the many policy decisions you make on the finance side is what is the basis of your rate, and imperviousness is a primary basis, but many communities will charge a gross area charge. Let's say 5 cents per gross acre per quarter or something like that, and then an impervious area charge on top of that. And that's because in that community they feel it's important that all properties pay regardless, and they might use some justification like, well, all properties have runoff, all properties are improved through the program, or all citizens are improved or helped with the program, and we're going to reflect that by charging some fee to all properties. So it's a rate decision that's made early in the process, and that is, what is the basis of your charge in your community? That's why you can't just cookie cutter it.
Right. Okay. So a variety of approaches. Here's another question that's sort of related to that from Matthew. He wants to know, are charges ever based not only on the amount of imperviousness, but where that impervious area is located in a watershed?
There are some communities that charge a different fee if you're contiguous to a stream or not. It's a little strange. For example, I think it is Boulder charges you more if you're next to a stream, and Portland charges you less if you're next to a stream. Boulder saying you're the sole beneficiary of all the flood control, therefore you should pay more, and Portland saying you don't use any of our system, therefore you should pay less. I don't know of someone who charges, and you're probably referring to the discussion of not all imperviousness is created equal, and you might want to push impervious to various parts of the watershed through your policies. And I don't know anybody who does that, because you have while you may have a philosophical reason for doing it, you have to have a physically based reason that has cost implications for your rate structure, not a philosophical basis for your rate structure.
Okay, and yet another sort of related question here. Melissa from Washington, D.C. Says that she's concerned that there are so few credits or incentives for residential customers, which represent a large portion of land area in many areas. And she would like to know, what are examples of successful incentives for this group that you find that are feasible to implement?
Well, bird baths are not. but that is the problem, is that they're such small properties. One way that it's done is through homeowners associations, and if that HOA does something in particular. What you normally do in that situation is not get into a crediting mechanism, but get into a rate structure itself that recognizes the fact that some properties have green areas or are designed with a green design, and the rate structure itself reflects that. A third way that you can do it is to say that if this whole neighborhood is designed using these certain principles, let's say LID principles, then you can give an LID credit to every property in that neighborhood, predicated on the fact that that system is kept up and that they're maintaining the system. And that's another way of doing it, but you have to sort of do it on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. House-to-house crediting is extremely difficult, and I wouldn't recommend it.
In Charlotte, the residential at that rate, you really can't justify paying for hardly any measures for it to be financial sensible, but we do have some individual residences that have credits if they had an existing pond or a pond for some other reason, and they routed their house drainage into the pond, they might qualify for a sizable credit. And Andy, I would add to what you said, we are looking at having some LID requirements, and one of the things we're looking at is to what extent would we pay for maintaining those, because homeowner associations are traditionally bad at that. If we give a fee credit but we're maintaining it, it feels odd to us. You know, our view would be it's either one or the other. If they want a fee credit for it, that would need to be something they maintain.
That's absolutely true. Another way that it's done is some residences are so big they look like commercial, and some residences, say above 10,000 square feet of imperviousness, qualify for all the credits that commercial qualifies for.
Okay, and we have a question for Jeb, kind of going off onto a different topic. But Jeb, I believe you mentioned some stream restoration projects, and Michael in Indiana would like to know if you could give some examples or tell more specifically what you've done.
In stream restoration, a lot of what we've done, we've sent a lot of our folks through Rosgan training, and I don't know if everybody knows what that is, but what that's looking is we spent a lot of years here straightening out channels and rip-wrapping them, and a lot of things like that move water quickly, but aren't very environmentally friendly. And we've gotten a good number of our staff trained in that, and we've developed curve numbers. We worked with some of the research agencies in the area to develop curve numbers, and so a lot of what we've done has been not just bioengineering, but also trying to restore the sinuosity to the streams and get those functioning as they more might have in nature, and actually downsizing. Instead of a 10-year channel, might be a smaller channel, but with sinuosity and trying to get a little bit of floodplain in it.
Okay, and back to the details of ways of setting fees here. Todd in Virginia wants to know, even though a fee based on impervious surfaces may seem more equitable, especially if you have varying impacts, he says a flat rate might be more palatable. What are your reactions to that?
We typically do residential in a flat rate or tiers, high, low, or high, medium, and low, because you don't want to get into the business of measuring at Minerva's new patio extension. The problem with a flat fee based on land use generalities, and there are fees that are developed that way, is that even within, and you typically use a zoning category, even within zoning, there is such variability, and the measuring of imperviousness is not that expensive, and you only do it once, and then it's not like a water bill that changes every month. Once you do it once, you've got it. Some communities have found that when they use what we might call an intensive development methodology, which is everybody who's zoned, I don't know, some commercial zoning pays so much per acre. While that's a quick and easy way to do it, you get a whole lot more questions about the equitability, because somebody might say, yeah, but I did this, and I've got a lot of green, and I'm not as intense, and I know I'm zoned the same, but my intensity is different, and so on. And you end up having to go back and do so many exceptions that it's just easier to do it the other way in the first place, unless you have a file like Cincinnati did, which is an actual land use file, and the zoning or the categories were tight enough that everybody within that rate category was similar enough that there weren't anomalies. But the looser your rate structure, the better your appeals process has to be.
Okay, and I think we're sort of out of time here, so I think I'll ask one more question. And let me just sort of peruse here and see what we've got. Here's one. Belen Garcia would like to know, has anyone dealt with charging a stormwater fee to a state or federal building? Or I'm going to add this to a nonprofit organization, and how does that work?
The state does pay us for their buildings. They do not pay us for their roads. And so there's a University of North Carolina at Charlotte. They pay. That was a long discussion, and it took several years before we finally negotiated them into it. But we bill them, and they pay.
The road situation in North Carolina is not particularly usual. Is that right, John?
That's correct. In North Carolina, I think we're usually second or third as far as number of state miles maintained, because North Carolina law doesn't allow counties to maintain roads. So all roads are either city or state. So we have a lot of state roads.
So that was a policy decision we made in North Carolina and we don't have time here to go into the justification of it. But the reality is, let's say for nonprofits, that the rain falls on the just and the unjust. Churches, have just as much runoff as anybody else, and they don't get a deal on their electric bill because they're a church. They don't get a deal on their water bill because they're a church. And if you want to maintain the purity of the rate structure, then our sort of goal is, sort of like bill everybody and let God sort them out. We sort of bill everybody and then make them take us to court. Now that doesn't mean that there hasn't been accommodation for universities, as in Durham's case. There's a special credit for large properties. In Vermont, roads are charged at, I think it's 2/3 the rate because part of the road is considered conveyance. In Texas, by state law, you can exempt churches. And so there are a lot of different accommodation. But for example, I think it was, I forget what city it was now in South Carolina, but they took the state DOT to the Supreme Court and won. And so, but then you've got Cincinnati that lost a federal case, as did Michigan. Lansing, Michigan lost a federal case. But go to that legal chapter and you'll get a real good discussion about that in the national document.
At this time, I'd like to conclude today's webcast. Thank you, Andy and Jeb, for presenting today, and of course, thanks to everyone that joined us. If you'd like to learn more about financing, I highly recommend the new guidance document developed by the National Association of Flood and Stormwater Managers under a grant from EPA that's entitled Guidance for Municipal Stormwater Funding. It is available at www.nafsma.org. I would like to remind you that this seminar will be archived so that you can access it after today's live presentation. The archive webcast will be available by July 30th. You can find the archived presentation at www.epa.npdes/training. We've posted today's speakers' contact information in case you would like to contact them after today. You can also find a comprehensive resource list by pressing the Resources button on your screen. We encourage you to visit EPA's NPDES training courses and workshops webpage for notices about upcoming webcasts. Our next webcast will be on August 9th. Charlie McPherson and Ansu John of Tetra Tech will discuss how to develop an effective public education program. Charlie and Ansu have been key members in the team that developed EPA's excellent Getting in Step manual on educating and involving stakeholders in watershed events. Please mark your calendars for this webcast on August 9th. Registration information will be posted at www.epa.gov/npds/training. That ends our webcast for today. Thank you very much.